So if you really want to understand your personality from the ground up, you've got to understand the cognitive functions. But this doesn't mean there aren't shortcuts to help you triangulate upon your most likely personality type. One example of which are the dichotomies of MBTI. As much beef as I personally have with them, if you get like ENFP, for example, on an online test that employs them, I'd say there's like 40% chance you might actually be that type. And another route is just to use the Big Five score, which is already significantly correlated with MBTI dichotomies anyway. That's what websites like 16 Personalities do, for example. But while these methods are, okay-ish, I'm going to give you a much more effective method in this video to use cognitive traits rather than cognitive functions to kind of triangulate upon your most likely underlying cognition. So what is a cognitive trait? Well, a cognitive trait is essentially the kind of almost behavioral property that emerges from a cognitive function being in a certain position within your psyche. And when I say position of cognitive functions, I'm really not referring to any kind of hierarchical 1, 2, 3, 4 system. The idea of one function being strong and then the other one being weak is ridiculously simplistic, and it really is not how human cognition tends to work. It's much better to view function positions in terms of ways. If a function is expressed in this way, therefore the function that counters it is going to be expressed in a different way, and these are going to be complementary. So it's not going to be like big, strong function versus weak, little, demonic function or whatever. Instead, it's going to be a natural balancing of opposites in a much more kind of Taoistic, yin and yang kind of way. And one thing that's always going to trip you up on your own personality typing journey is using things like this deterministically rather than probabilistically. Just because MBTI says you are judging whatever type, it doesn't mean you're going to have the underlying cognitive functions of what is associated with being a judging type. It doesn't mean, for example, you're going to be a TE dominant or TE authority like an ISTJ. You might be an ENFP despite receiving a judging score on an online test. These are two separate things. The whole judging dichotomy is just a probabilistic way of guessing what your functions are. And it's the same with cognitive traits. I'm going to talk about NI dominance here, or TE dominance. And TE is something that gets stereotyped a lot. Just because you get typed as a TE dominant, it doesn't mean you're automatically very industrious. It just means you're probabilistically more likely than other types to be so. There are always exceptions to the rule. And please, if you ever encounter any system saying, this is always like this type does this and therefore does not do that, if you ever see systems speaking in that deterministic fashion, please take them with a grain of salt. Human behavior, and especially human cognition, is very complex. And one last disclaimer, just because people share a cognitive trait in common, for example, an INTJ and an INFJ both NI dominance, and that is a trait that emerges from cognition, it does not mean that actual cognition is similar. People can be very similar on a trait level and have entirely separate internal worlds. So now let's present to you 4 different types of traits that can help you triangulate upon your most likely cognitive type. So the first trait category is going to be interaction. So when a person has a certain cognitive element in dominant position, for example, introverted intuition, this is going to have an effect upon their natural intrinsic sense of ethics. Not ethics in terms of right and wrong and stuff, more on a cognitive level of kind of modus operandi. The dominant element is kind of like the waters we swim within. It informs our every action, but it doesn't necessarily feel like this thing we're actively seeing or even using all the time. It is much more like a cognitive atmosphere. NI dominance equals observation. It's a tendency to kind of passively observe and assimilate information over time. It tends to resist interaction. You'll notice NI dominant people might move a bit slower. They might be a bit slower on the uptake. They'll need to do things in their own time and on their own way. And they tend to resist actively interacting with the world. Even for introverts, they tend to need more of a buffer between themselves and the physical external reality. So while all introverts are naturally more observant people, NI dominants tend to be especially observant. They're going to be passively absorbing and reaching perspectives. Extroverted intuitive dominance, on the other hand, is going to be an exploration trait. These people are going to be actively exploring and interacting with many different contexts in the external world. If someone's highly culturally aware, for example, if they understand many different memes across the internet, if they're actually physically jumping from one location to another, moving house every couple of years, if their life motto is going to be like variety is the spice of life, then exploration is probably going to be the dominant trait. And there's a good chance they'll be in any dominant based upon that probabilistic triangulation. The trait of SI dominance, on the other hand, is going to be solidification. It's going to look similar to NI dominance in the sense they're quite observant and they don't want to be overwhelmed with new information. But you're going to notice a trait akin to really wanting to get things right. They're going to be repeating things more frequently than an NI dominant because they really want to verify it to make sure it's actually true and reliable. SI dominance is all about finding consistencies. Does this work? Cool. What about if I try it again? Does it still work? Yes, it does. Okay, I feel more secure now. SE dominance, on the other hand, is going to have a cognitive trait of immersion. If you're seeing someone much more happily really going into something, really diving into it, immersing themselves within a new environment and really getting to know it, giving it their all, every single fibre of their being is committed to the engagement, it's more likely this person's going to have a dominant element of extroverted sensing. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll be in a moment all the time. For example, a lot of ESTPs are always anticipating what's going to happen next. But you're going to notice they'll be giving a lot of their energy to something. And there's going to be a natural intensity with the way in which they interact with the outside world. It's very much the opposite of the NI dominant, who naturally, on a trait level, abstains from that kind of physical, external engagement. Introverted thinking dominant is going to be more like expertise. This is going to be maintaining and solidifying a framework over time. Unlike SI dominance, which seeks to verify for the sake of experience, TI dominance here really wants to achieve a sense of competence in a very personalized way. So these guys are going to be storing, refining, and maintaining frameworks over time with an end goal of kind of competence across situations that they care about. SI dominants may not care as much about competence because they want to make sure something is actually reliable. TI dominants are going to really prioritize that feeling of knowing what they're talking about, knowing what they're doing, and being able to be called upon in order to maybe share their knowledge with other people or lend people their own expertise. So you could say there's a bit more ego involved in the competence of a TI dominant. Introverted feeling, I mean, you probably guessed it, the cognitive trait here is going to be called authenticity. The agenda here on a behavioral level is often more towards self-realization and really owning and accepting the emotions that are coming to the surface. A lot of people claim to be very emotionally intelligent and so on, but generally FI dominant people are, again, probabilistically more likely to really own what they're feeling, to not try and push it down in favour of some kind of narrative of who they think they are, for example, and say, no, for better or worse, I am feeling anxious, I am feeling afraid, I am feeling shame, I am feeling guilty, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling joyous. All of these things are going to be much more on the table in front of the person. Because again, these are the waters the type swims within. They don't necessarily resonate with the idea of always interacting with their emotions all the time, because oftentimes they're doing it so passively as it may even escape their attention. And the trait of extroverted feeling dominance is going to be integration. It's often to find a mission, to find a purpose, to find a way to integrate with the human race. I mean, so many ENFJs tend to mistype as INTJ because they'll read the ridiculous descriptions of INTJs and resonate with a very valid part of it, which is going to be that impact, that mission, that sense of self-determination. But oftentimes extroverted feeling dominants embrace this behavioral modality in order to integrate with the larger collective. And extroverted thinking dominance is going to be industriousness. Do you find yourself consistently leaving a mark? Can you not help but to take on a new challenge, a new project? Do you just feel better when the momentum of jumping from one goal to another one is carrying you forward in life? I wouldn't say this is as probable as the other ones, but it's still a good way of triangulating upon whether or not you might be a TE dominant. So if you're more observant and passive, you might be an NI dominant, contrary to a lot of silly descriptions. If you're more kind of exploratory and active, trans-contextual, you're going to be more likely an NE dominant. If you really want to make sure the ground under your feet is solid and you're going to continuously verify facts, experiences, passions, what have you, in order to make sure these are stable, SI dominance might be more likely. And if you find yourself just having a lot more energy to give to a single thing than a lot of people, and can really dive into something and make the most of it, really give it your all, then SE dominance might be more likely. If you really crave a sense of continuous competence and expertise and spend a lot of time and energy really refining your own frameworks of how things are done, how things should be, how you do things, then TI dominance might be more likely. FI dominance, are you prioritizing authenticity, really looking your own emotions in the eye and accepting them for what they are, really embracing them, not pushing them down, not giving them names that do not represent what they actually are, and not denying the emotions that are uncomfortable to your own self-narrative? Well, FI dominance might be more likely then. And do you find most of your goals and your sense of purpose in life tend to have a societal origin point? Do you really want to impact society on a larger level? Do you really want to embody something that people can see, for example, and be inspired by? Do you seek a purpose, a mission? Well, FE dominance might be more likely then. And the second cognitive trait we're going to be looking at is one which arises from the natural resistance between what we call the agency position in CPT. That's going to be like the tertiary function in MBTI, and its opposite orientation, which is why in other blog posts and websites and YouTube videos you may have heard people refer to the blind spot. Well, this is what the blind spot is. It's that point of greatest resistance, a natural consequence of a person really doubling down their experience of agency on a specific orientation of a specific position. So a cognitive element in agency position is one which is protected from its inverse orientation. And this agency position is going to be the position complementing the dominant. So for example, if it's an ISFP, it's going to be NI agency. If it's an INTP, SI agency. If an ESTJ, NE agency. So that's how to interpret this particular section. So if introverted intuition is in this position, then the cognitive trait is quest. It's going to be really feeling yourself on a particular trajectory and no matter what, resisting alternatives, because alternatives are the realm of extroverted intuition. If you hate brainstorming, for example, if you find yourself very stubborn and difficult to persuade away from a chosen path or muse that your cognition is taking you. If you find yourself resistant to other perspectives when you feel really pushed along a particular path. And if you just feel this muse which is carrying you in a specific direction, that no matter what, at least within its half-life of inspiration, you cannot really be distracted from, then this may be a cognitive trait, and therefore you might be an NI agency type, like an ISFP or ISTP. If it's NE agency, then it's all about freedom, resisting determinism, leaving things open. ESTJs and ESFJs, while they may have that very sentinel stereotype, these types are going to be very freedom-oriented. They're going to be doing things and even securing their own stability for themselves, so that means they always have the option. They get to decide when they move house. They get to decide when they go on holiday. They get to decide when they promote an employee. And so they're going to resist that kind of quest-like mentality because they don't like the idea of being spurred on in a single direction. They like flexibility. That's why ESTJs may not always have a great sense of self-archetype, self-concept, because again, that binds them to a specific direction. And ESFJs may not have a good sense of like holistic philosophical categories, because again, it binds them to a specific way of experiencing the world, experiencing culture. SI agency types are going to have the cognitive trait of flow. These types are really going to hate being yanked away from what they're doing. They love having these windows of time where they can just kind of exist in a natural state of timelessness a lot of the time. And when something yanks them away from that flow, they're going to find it very stressful. SE agency is going to have a cognitive trait of experience. They're going to be resisting triviality. They want everything to feel significant and impactful. They may even resist getting into a flow, because then things may feel loose and watery when they want them to feel really strong and concrete. Introverted thinking agency, this is going to be the cognitive trait of method. These types are going to have their own specific way of doing things, and they really do not like, for example, delegating to people with a different method. They'll often take things onto their own shoulders in order to make sure they are done in a way that they think they should be done. They're very much resisting reliance upon other people. Extroverted thinking agency is going to be more like whims. They need their introverted feeling to ignite their extroverted thinking whenever it wants to, without them being bound by external rules that say, you should not follow this whim, you should not follow this impulse. Keep in mind, a rational element in agency position is serving an experiential agenda. So ESFPs and ENFPs, they really love to be able to use that extroverted thinking in order to navigate the external world in a fun and creative way. The cognitive trait of introverted feeling agency, this is applying to ISTJs and INTJs, is going to be pride. So someone with this trait, who therefore may have an ISTJ or INTJ cognition, are going to be resisting influence from other people. They're going to be resisting other people manipulating them, for example. They're going to be resisting peer pressure. And oftentimes they'll even rather unconsciously, automatically resist sharing themselves with other people. So that means they don't give other people ammunition. And the extroverted feeling agency trait is going to be depersonalization. These types are more likely to resist meaning. They want everything to be kind of taken into a more detached and cerebral understanding of reality, where everything is both meaningful and meaningless at the same time. It's kind of a more absurdist perspective of the world. Why do they do this? Because for as long as something can be allowed to be ambiguous in its own meaning, then they don't have to be personally attached to it. Because again, these agency positions are resisting their inverse orientation. ENTPs and ESTPs can be incredibly ethical, kind, compassionate, moral people. But but they'll often be surprised by themselves when they behave in such a fashion. Not because they don't do it all the time, but because it's a more raw and vulnerable part of themselves they're trying to detach from. An alternative trait could be called intellectualization. But this could sometimes imply a more high-level abstract thought than is necessarily the case. The third cognitive trait we're going to be looking at is triggers. This pertains to the authority position in CPT, which is like the parent function in other systems, the classic auxiliary of MBTI, like extroverted feeling in an ISFJ. This is very antagonistic to the ego and tends to be highly critical of it. It places natural restrictions upon one's own cognition in order to kind of counterbalance the dominant pairing. And due to the state of natural tension between itself and the realm of the ego, this can give rise to natural feelings of anger pertaining to it. So the trigger of the NI authority type is going to be uncertainty. They need to know what's going to happen next. They need to know where they're going and why they're doing it. There's an innate sense of purposefulness for this particular type, ENFJs and ENTJs. They essentially borrow stability from the future rather than the present. And they can even feel more comfortable within an insecure present for as long as they know what's going to happen next. And so you might not be surprised to hear that the trigger of the any authority type, INTPs and INFPs, is going to be certainty. Any authority types tend to get triggered by sweeping generalizations, arbitrary laws, arrogance, and the onset of inevitability. For the SI authority type, like ESFJs and ESTJs, the trigger tends to be instability. Are the things that the person values and holds dear for the sake of continuity being taken away or threatened? Are their resources being threatened, for example? Are they losing contact with people they hold dear? And again, going back to my Barnum effect video, all of these things are going to be relatable. It's just the degree to which one thing is relatable more than another that determines your more likely cognition. Especially since we're looking at traits at the moment, not even cognitive functions. And traits are way more wishy-washy. And the extroverted sensing authority type are going to be triggered more by stagnation. These types are typically going to be the most sensitive to boredom. I'm talking ISTPs and ISFPs. They really need something to consistently light up their motivational fuel in order to fuel the transformative tendencies of their NI agency function. TI authority types are going to be more triggered by thoughtlessness, when they see hypocrisy and conflicting information, when they feel like no sources can be relied upon to give accurate intel. These can be pretty triggering for these types. ESTPs and ENTPs might be most triggered when they see someone they know suddenly seizing the act of coherent thought, suddenly becoming clumsy, suddenly becoming inconsiderate of the logical ramifications of what they're doing. Both ENTPs and ESTPs can be both triggered by ENFPs and ESFPs, because ESFP and ENFP cognition is the realm of natural impulsivity and spontaneity, giving caution to the wind and dropping the TI altogether. Extroverted thinking authority types are going to be most triggered by baselessness. If you care about something, act on it and protect it. TE authority types like INTJs and ISTJs are going to be especially triggered by apathy and negligence. Admittedly, introverted feeling authority types are some of the least naturally triggered people I've ever met. But if there's one thing that probably will trigger them the most, it's going to be suppression. If you're suppressing your own self-expression, your own core drives, just unwilling to communicate with your own authentic self beneath the veneer and facade. ESFPs and ENFPs are going to be at best confused and at worst angry. The FE authority types, on the other hand, I'm talking ISFJs and INFJs, are going to be most triggered by disruption. They're kind of like the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. They really don't like it when people come in and make a splash for no good reason. Disturbers of the peace. Which is kind of ironic because Gandalf's an INFJ. If someone's calling out problems into the open too often, if they're being too open and expressive with things that they're not particularly enjoying or perhaps resenting, you can be sure the FE authority types are going to be building up some resentment behind the scenes. But unlike the other types, because FE authority types are often so naturally restrained, they have an inherent nobility they can even resent about themselves a lot of the time. It'll probably come across a little bit more passive-aggressively than overt. And the fourth and final cognitive trait I'm going to be giving you in this video to help you determine your core cognitive type are going to be sensitivities. These pertain to the oppositional position, that is the inferior function in MBTI. You know, I once made a video, ranting about the word inferior, and someone posted a cool comment. They said, the term inferior, especially in the time that it was written, could have pertained more to like an anatomical position than necessarily a derogatory remark. And in this sense, I don't really have an issue with the word inferior too much, because many small muscles, for example, inferior muscles, are highly sensitive ones. They're important, but they can't necessarily take a lot of strain on their own. And that really does encapsulate the inherent sensitivity and purity of this element. But I would say this is a position furthest from the ego, so I wouldn't necessarily look to yourself and your own knowledge about yourself to determine whether or not these are your traits, but rather get someone you know, especially someone who isn't really versed in these MBTI-ish waters, to tell you which ones they think you are. A larger sample pool, even better. So for NI oppositional types, the sensitivity is going to be the unknown. Here be the land of conspiracy theories. Of course, I'm joking, but there is more of a tendency for this position to go in that particular direction. Because oftentimes, although not always, conspiracy theories are enacted in order to make life more simple. They're essentially filling in the unknown with something that they can see, something that they can call out. I don't know whether or not this is true, so therefore I'm going to subscribe to a theory that allows me to give it a name on some level, to give it a form. So if introverted intuition is the most sensitive position, life is going to be simplified on some level to reduce uncertainty. If not conspiracy theories, it might just be a general overview of what life seems to be, accepting what you see at face value. That's the other end of the spectrum. Being here and now, going from moment to moment, resisting, confronting the unknown, and if you do confront the unknown, perhaps being more conspiratorial, giving it a shape that it doesn't necessarily have in order to make it feel more controllable on some level, less scary. When extroverted intuition is in oppositional position, the sensitivity here is going to be to disruptions. Uncertainty is very much accepted. Oftentimes, SI dominants live in the world of natural uncertainty. They embrace it. They accept the unknown and unknowable. But this chaos must be controlled and accounted for them to continue verifying the reality they are within. If something is just coming in out of nowhere and forcing the SI dominant to improvise, this is going to be a fairly sensitive and raw nerve. I kind of like the cognitive trait for extroverted sensing oppositional because it's so damn relatable. This is energy conservation. An NI dominant is practically a walking battery. Most boundaries pertaining to these types have less to do with what they want and don't want, for example, and much more to do with, do they have energy for it? Can they cope? Introverted thinking oppositional is going to be correctness. You can do whatever you want, just don't make the wrong decision. The extroverted thinking oppositional sensitivity is going to be perfectionism. It could always be better, but what's the standard again? How do I know what's better and what isn't? I better just continue working at it until maybe one day I'll feel happy about it. And even then, probably not, even when everybody says what an amazing job I've done. The introverted feeling oppositional sensitivity, this is for the TE dominant, is going to be desire. You can do whatever you want, just don't get in my way. Or worse, stop me from doing what I want. And finally, the extroverted feeling oppositional sensitivity, that is of the INTP and ISTP, is going to be embarrassment. The last thing these types tend to want is to look like a fool, to be made a fool of. The introverted sensing is often related to cognitive traits pertaining to stability, continuity. Well, if this is the most sensitive position within you, you're going to seek the greatest continuity of all, the continuity of the self. When these types feel threatened, starved, or debilitated, they tend to get pretty anxious. And they'll tend to engage in very self-protective behavior, for example, flight. So again, we're doubling down on this dominant function to make up for a feeling of insecurity, to make sure that we do not get hurt by that area of great sensitivity.